Russia's biggest mobile carrier is joining forces with Huawei. The Chinese tech giant will build the 5G network for Russia. Canada is still considering whether Huawei could be a player in its 5G network. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump has signed an executive order banning American companies from using telecommunications equipment made by firms posing a national security risk, a risk that many claim comes with doing business with Huawei. Joining me now from Washington is James Lewis, Senior Vice President and the Director of the Technology Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also a former member of the U.S. Foreign Service who worked on the high-tech trade with China. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So we talk a lot about Huawei and whether or not it's a national security concern. You worked intimately in this space. What is it specifically about Huawei that makes it such a potential threat?
Huawei is closely linked to the Chinese government and the Chinese security services. That's been true from the start. It was founded by a PLA member. It gets giant subsidies from the Chinese government to make sure that it can dominate the market. It has a long record of commercial espionage, including against Nortel. One of the reasons Nortel went out of business was because of Huawei spying. It's just not a company you should trust. And if you use it in your 5G networks, it gives China a greater opportunity for espionage, and it gives them the potential to disrupt telecommunication services whenever they want. So all those reasons make Huawei a deeply troubling partner in telecommunications.
Are you surprised that, given all those reasons, the Canadian government is still considering this?
Not at all. Many countries have this problem. China's a big market. And so if you look at Germany, if you look at Britain, they don't want to alienate the Chinese market. And the Chinese will punish you if you ban Huawei. When Australia banned Huawei, they immediately cut Australian coal exports, which are the biggest exports from Australia to China. So you have a punitive customer who will punish you. And people say to themselves, I'm stuck. I either open myself to Chinese coercion and espionage, or I keep the China market, and that's a hard decision.
Is there any way that Huawei technology can be integrated that wouldn't compromise national security, or is it black and white?
This is the big debate. The British argue that if you keep Huawei to the edge of the network, if you don't let them in sensitive locations like you didn't let them supply around Ottawa, that is enough to mitigate the risk. The only way to eliminate the risk is to ban Huawei, but the British say this sort of partial ban works well enough. On the other hand, if you talk to the Australians, they say it's only a ban. The ban is the only thing that works. But this is the big debate.
We have a situation where President Trump is kind of putting Huawei on the table as a negotiating tactic with the Chinese in this trade deal. Does that undermine the national security argument in the eyes of allies if it's something that the president is willing to negotiate away if he gets the deal he wants?
The Chinese put Huawei on the table from the start, and they put Meng, the CFO, who's being detained in Vancouver, on the table. So these are things that the Chinese want. The American intelligence and defense communities feel very strongly that it would be a mistake to buy from Huawei. Most U.S. companies, the big telcos, don't buy from Huawei. But it is a trade topic, in part because the Chinese keep bringing it up, and that does make people uncertain.
Something Canada has been suffering through recently with China after arresting the CFO of Huawei. They've taken it out on canola imports. They've been looking at potentially closer inspections on meat, which they say may be contaminated. There's a lot of fear in the agricultural sector here that they're going to be picked on further by China because Canada is not complying in releasing the CFO of Huawei. What do you think Canadians should expect in terms of Chinese punishment?
You know, look at China's behavior towards its own citizens. They are very punitive. They are not bound by the law. They do what they want, and they can be. This is a country that has almost 2 million people in re-education camps in northern China because of their religion. They're a tough partner. For me, I have the luxury of being in a country that can, with some difficulty say to the Chinese, we don't need your money. But for other countries, it's a lot harder. And I hear this in Europe. I hear this in Southeast Asia. I think it's a legitimate problem.
What do you think Prime Minister Trudeau should do next? He hasn't picked up the phone to call the president of China yet. There are some who say he should do that. There's others who say that risks escalating it for Canadians who are detained in China. What advice would you give on how to deal with China at this point?
This is the time to pick up the phone and say, you know, all those Canadians that you've detained for no apparent reason, you know, these trade threats, you have to back away. Now, Canada, like everyone else, would have to be prepared if they decide to ban Huawei to face some retaliation. But I think now's the moment of leverage, at least for the Canadians who are being falsely imprisoned. In the long run, people may have to make a choice. This is the choice that faces the British now. We don't have a readout of the president's talks in the UK, but the British, they'd like to have it both ways. They'd like to sell to China, and they'd like a free trade agreement with America. And increasingly in the US, the position is you get one or the other, you don't get both. And so for Canada, it's a tough choice. That's why people hope the partial ban would work. You can give a little to the Chinese, a little to national security. I would probably say you're going to have to think hard about why you wouldn't ban Huawei, why you would take the risk of letting them into your networks. And it's something that could make not only the relationship difficult with the U.S., but more importantly, Canada's economic future difficult when it comes to China.
Mr. Lewis, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.